the people of Gibeon are crafty, and they decide that the best way to deal with the Israelites is to make a treaty with them. But they know that the people of Israel have been told that God has commanded them not to make a treaty with anyone in the land, and so they decide to deceive them into thinking that they are a people from very far away. And so they come and they tell them, we're from very far away, when the truth is that they're just from, a few miles down the road. If you started in the morning, you could walk from where the Israelites were camped to where the Gibeonites lived, to the city of Gibeon. And so they tell them that they are from very far away, and they have come with a whole system devised to convince the Israelites that they are from very far away. And so they come with, before they leave home to come and propose this treaty, they put on old, worn-out sandals, shoes, and they put on worn-out clothing, and they pack up old, hard, moldy bread, and they carry the oldest, cracked-up wineskins or water skins that they can find to carry their water in. And when they get there, they say, make a treaty with us. We've heard of the fame of your people and of your God, and we want to make sure that there is peace between us. And so make a treaty with us. And the elders of Israel and Joshua reply and say, well, how do we know that you are not from nearby? How can we tell that you aren't from close by? And so they start pulling out their stuff, and they say, well, look at this clothing that we're wearing. It's all worn out, and it was brand new when we put it on. And these shoes, look how our sandals are worn through, and they were new when we put them on. Look at our bread, and it was fresh out of the oven when we set out. And now see how hard and old and moldy it is. And then look at our water skins and how cracked and dry they are. And they were brand new when we left home. And the Israelites look at all of this stuff. The leaders of Israel and Joshua look at all this stuff, and they're convinced by it. And the text says that they sampled their provisions and saw that it was how they had described it, but they did not inquire of the Lord. And so they make a treaty with them and make this binding oath and covenant with them, and send them away, and then very quickly thereafter find out that they were not actually from way, way, way far away outside the land of Canaan, but were practically next door neighbors. And so then they go to them and kind of call them on the carpet and confront them and say, why did you deceive us? And their answer was, in short, we were pretty sure you were going to kill us if we didn't. And so that our lives were on the line. And so we know we deceived you, and so our lives are in your hands. Do whatever you think is best. And so the Israelites now, Joshua goes and asks God what to do with them, and God says, you've made a commitment, you have to honor it. You've made this oath to them, and you have to keep your promise. So don't attack them. Keep your word to them. You've made a treaty with them, and you're going to keep it. And so they go back, and Joshua tells the Gibeonites that they will honor their agreement, but the Gibeonites, have to serve the people of Israel by being water carriers and lumber cutters, or lumberjacks basically, for the tabernacle and the Levites encamped around it. And so they have to provide water and fuel, lumber for the tabernacle and sacrifices and things. And that's their duty, their job from then on. And so the people of Gibeon have to come up with a load of lumber and have to carry water in to wherever the tabernacle is set up from this point on. And they agree to it. They're happy to accept this relatively small activity, service that they have to do in exchange for, not being killed off or driven out of the land. Well, when some of the surrounding cities, the other tribes in the area, hear what the Gibeonites have done and that they have made a treaty with the Israelites, they fear that it's more of a military and political treaty than it really is, and that the Gibeonites and the Israelites are going to be fighting together against all the other tribes. And so several of these other cities, 5 of them actually, band together and decide to attack the Gibeonites and wipe them out before the Israelites can benefit from this relationship or this treaty. And so this band of 5 cities gets together and sends their armies, and one of these cities actually is Jerusalem, which is important, later. But one of these cities is Jerusalem, and these 5 cities get together and attack the Gibeonites. And in response to this attack, because of the treaty that they have just made, the Israelites have to come and defend the Gibeonites. They have to come and fight against these 5 armies. And so they come. God tells them to go to honor their word, to defend the Gibeonites. And so they go and they fight against these 5 armies, and the Israelites are victorious. They're winning. And the 5 combined armies of these cities are being routed, and they're starting to panic and retreat. And Joshua looks and realizes that they don't have enough hours left in the day to finish off this army. That if the army retreats, then there's not going to be enough time to kill them all off, and they're just going to end up having to fight parts of this army later. And the kings over these 5 armies, or the kings over these 5 cities that command these armies, they haven't been captured and dealt with yet. And so Joshua prays and asks God to give him more time, and to make the sun stand still in the sky, to give them the additional time that they need to fight this battle. And he does. And they're given several additional hours, up to about an extra day of daylight, in order to fight this battle and win and defeat these 5 armies, and to capture and kill these 5 kings. And they do, which is kind of the end of the opposition of these 5 cities. Now these 5 cities have been defeated, and the people of Gibeon that this treaty has been made with are defended. And after this, that takes us through chapter 10, or most of chapter 10. And then after this, we're told about 2 more big campaigns, or big pushes that the people of Israel make. The first is in the southern part of the land, down in around where Jerusalem, and basically south of where they came in at Jericho. And so they push south and push the peoples back and conquer several cities in that area. And then that campaign ends, and they turn and do basically the same thing to the north, and they push back and fight against several cities, and they conquer many of them, and just the battles, God gives them the victory in both of these campaigns, both to the south and to the north, and they end up pushing back the peoples out of these lands for a good long way. And then in chapter 11 of Joshua, we see the northern campaign in the beginning of chapter 11, and in the end of chapter 11, we get this, the beginning of this summary of their victories, summary of the various conquests. And then in chapter 12, we get this list of the defeated kings, the list of all of the cities, the kings of the cities that the Israelites fought against and were victorious against. And basically this, you might think that these battles for these cities might not be the only thing worth recording, but basically this was the only places of any military importance were these walled cities. Open land or a few caves here and there weren't going to be very much of military value, and there was no need to have forts outside of these cities when the cities themselves were fortified with walls. And so when you captured a city, especially with each city being kind of its own independent state or independent entity, there was really no need to do anything else other than take these fortified cities. If you did that, then you controlled the whole area, controlled the land. And so in chapter 12, we have this list of all of the various cities that Israel was sent against, that they fought against and defeated their kings and conquered. And you can read the whole list if you want to, but the final note is 31 in all. And so 31 kings of 31 cities are defeated, and the Israelites have their territory. And then that kind of ends this second major section of Joshua, the take section. And chapter 13, transitions us into the divide section. And the first part of this section in chapter 13 is a listing of the lands that were still unconquered, the parts of the promised land that had not been fully taken over. And God has told them in the past, and would remind them again in the next book, that the purpose of these tribes that God has not already given them victory over is that they would take the land bit by bit, that they would continue to fight and take the land, but they wouldn't do it all at once. God intended for it to be done slowly, partially so that they would, infrastructure and things would not be, left to decay and be destroyed, and wild animals wouldn't come in and take the land over and be a problem for them in the future. They could take over these cities from these other tribes, and the infrastructure would still be there. But if they destroyed these cities and then left them empty until they could inhabit the area and defend it, then who knows what would grow up in the area, what wild animals would come and be a problem for them in the future. So take them bit by bit. But then also so that the people of Israel would continuously have something to do, something to fight against, to remain martially capable, so that they would be constantly practiced in fighting, so they'd be able to defend themselves. And so God didn't want them to drive to just send all of these tribes out all at once and take it all over all at once, so that there'd be something for the military of Israel to keep doing to stay capable, stay practiced. And then finally, God tells them that these people are there to be a kind of a test to them, and if they don't follow God's commands to continue to fight and to push them out, if they get complacent and allow them to remain and instead start trying to trade with them and to make agreements with them and to intermarry with them, to marry their daughters and have the Israelites' daughters married to them, then these peoples are going to be a huge obstacle and stumbling block to Israel, and they will lead them into idolatry and to abandon God, and will lead to their downfall. And so that's God's purposes for leaving these people behind, for not taking Israel to defeat them all at once. And then there is an account, starting in chapter 14, there is an account of the division of the land, how the land is to be divided, what borders each tribe is supposed to have. So what tribe or what part of the land belongs to Judah, and then there's a listing of the cities that are in that land to make it extra clear. And then what are the shapes of the borders? What is the border supposed to look like for the tribe of Reuben, and what cities are in Reuben's territory, and so on through all the tribes. This section actually begins and ends with a special allotment for Caleb at the beginning and then for Joshua at the end. If you remember, Caleb and Joshua were the two spies that were faithful back in the book of Numbers. The other 10 convinced the whole nation to not cross over into the Jordan, or to not cross over into the promised land and take it at that point. And so the whole nation ended up wandering in the desert for 40, or in the wilderness for 40 years. But Joshua and Caleb were faithful, and so God promised them a special allotment. And so the very beginning and the very end of this section on the allotments for the different tribes is the special allotment for Caleb first, and then Joshua at the end. And then in chapter 20, there's a discussion of the cities of refuge, and I think I mentioned those before, but just in case, reminder, the cities of refuge were intended to be these kind of haven cities where if you were involved in or were accused of homicide, if you were accused of killing somebody, or if you had accidentally killed somebody or were there when somebody was killed, and the suspicion falls on you and the family is out for blood, those that are related to the person that died are out for you for vengeance, because that was permissible for the family to kill back the person that killed one of their members. And so if that's you could flee to, if you were the one accused or suspected, you could flee to one of these cities of refuge. And then the family did not have the right to pursue vengeance against you directly. They had to go to the city leadership, to the governor of the city, and basically put you on trial. And so you had an opportunity to have your case heard and to be given a trial and be declared guilty or not guilty. And if you were declared guilty, then you were bound up and handed over to the family to do with whatever they wanted. And so they could take vengeance on you if they wanted to, if you were found guilty. But if not, or if it was found that it was an accidental death, or that you didn't have any intention of hurting the person, killing the person, but it just happened, then you could either go free or you could live in the city for the rest of your life and not be worried about the family being able to take vengeance on you. They couldn't do it inside the city. And so these cities of refuge were kind of a very early kind of first attempt at a trial. Instead of having direct vengeance taken on you by a family member of somebody that has died, instead they have to go and prove their case in a court setting. They have to prove it before a judge, and you have to be found guilty before you can be punished for that crime. And it didn't cover everything. It was just for murder, but still, it was this kind of early version of criminal justice system that been developed out more fully, and is a precursor to what we have today. So that's the cities of refuge. And then there's, in chapter 21, there is an account of these towns for the Levites. If you remember, the tribe of Levi was the tribe that is specially dedicated to the care of the tabernacle and later the temple, and then to the spiritual needs of all of Israel. And so there are different clans and families within the tribe of Levi that have different duties and jobs, including things like breaking down and carrying the tabernacle for the temporary structure to make it transportable, the maintenance of various things in the tabernacle, teaching and educating all the people of the other tribes in the law and worship of God. And so there's all of these different duties and all these different jobs within the tribe of Levi, but they're all dedicated specifically to God and to the worship of God. So it'd be kind of what you might think of now as the pastor and various leadership positions and maintenance positions in your local church. And so they didn't get a territory of their own. Instead, they were given a few cities in each territory. And so each tribe had a few cities within that were given to the Levites. And they would control the city and the area immediately surrounding the city so that they could plant crops in the land surrounding the city and survive off of that. But most of what they got and what they needed came from the tithes given from the rest of the tribes. So was the purpose or the function of the tribe of Levi. And so they were given cities in everybody's territory in order to fulfill those teaching and guiding roles that they were supposed to have in the tribes. And then that's the divide section in summary. If you want to go back and read it, you can, but it does get a little dry when you don't know much about what these cities were, where they were, and it's hard to imagine the shape of these territories just from the names and descriptions of the borders. But that's the divide section. They divide out the land, and Israel needs this section as a kind of permanent record of the land as God intended for it to be divided among them. And then we come to the final section, the serve section. And in this section is 22 through 24, the last 3 chapters. And it begins with this odd account of the tribes that were on the other side of the Jordan River. If you remember, pretty sure in this class we mentioned that before they crossed over into the promised land, before Moses died, there were some tribes that opposed the Israelites passing through, and so they had to fight against them, and they killed the kings, and they took the territory, and some of the tribes, one tribe and part of another tribe, asked to be given the land on that side of the river to begin to settle even before they got into the promised land. And it was agreed that they could do that, they could have that land, that was okay, that could be their land, but they still had to send their fighting forces over with the rest of the Israelites and help the rest of their Israelite family, the rest of the Israelite nation, conquer their home, just as all of Israel had helped them to conquer this land on the other side of the Jordan. So it wouldn't have been fair for them to have the whole nation help them conquer this territory on the east side of the Jordan, and then for them not to contribute to conquering everybody else's home. And so they agree, they cross over, they fight, and now we're at the end of all of that, the big period of the conquest, and the land has been apportioned out and divided, and each of the tribes is supposed to be responsible for driving out the remaining peoples and taking over various cities within the area that they have been granted, that's their land. And so these tribes from the other side of the Jordan, once they've already started to settle there, it's time for their fighting men to go home. And so they do. They go home, and they build a monument on the east side of the Jordan River in the shape of an altar. And they build this altar there, and their intention, as we find out towards the end of the story, their intention is to have this constant reminder that they are not separate from the rest of Israel, even though there's a river dividing their territories, that they are still part of Israel, and they're still part of the worship of God. And so this altar-shaped monument is there intending to be a constant reminder of the relationship between those on that side of the Jordan River and the tabernacle and their part in Israel. And so it's basically they're intending it as a monument to the unity of the tribes on each side of the Jordan. But when the tribes on the other side of the Jordan see them building this altar across the river, they think that these tribes on the other side are trying to set up their own altar and begin worship separate from the tabernacle, which is not allowed. That was one of the laws given, is that they should not have multiple altars to make sacrifices to God on. And so the people on the west side of the Jordan, in Canaan proper, these 10.5 tribes over there, look back at the tribes on the other side, see them building this altar, and think that they're trying to break off and start a new religion, or to start worshiping God separately and be a separate people. And that's not okay, according to the law. And so they gather up and get ready to go and fight against the tribes on the other side and destroy their altar and subjugate them, basically force them to stop. Fortunately, before they get there to the actual, landing of blows, they have a conversation and figure out that they did not actually intend this to be a rebellion or separation, and they avoid a civil war. And instead, both sides recognize this monument for what it's intended to be. It's this monument of the unity between the peoples. And then, in chapter 23, Joshua begins to say his farewells to the people, remind them all that God has done. He has reached an old age, he's gotten old, and there's still land to be conquered. There's still tribes that don't have the full measure of their inheritance. They're supposed to continue to push the people out, and if they don't, there's going to be consequences for that. He reminds them of all of that, and then renews the covenant with them, and there is the fairly famous or fairly well-known line of Joshua, the choice that Joshua places in front of them, much as Moses did at the end of Deuteronomy. So chapter 24, I'll start reading in verse 14. It says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him in all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your ancestors worshipped beyond the Euphrates River and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your ancestors served beyond the Euphrates or the gods of the Amorites in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Then the people answered, "Far be it from us to forsake the Lord. God has done all this for us, given us all this. Of course we will serve the Lord." And so they renew the covenant, make the covenant again, and then Joshua dies. Joshua is an older man, and he dies at the age of 110. And Israel, so the book kind of concludes with the people of Israel serving God and remaining faithful to the Lord during the entire lifetime of Joshua. And then I don't remember if we got to say it, if I mentioned it in this class or not, but at the very end of Genesis, Joseph is old. He's about to die, and so he asks his brothers and all their children, and basically the people of Israel that are surrounding him at that point, the ones that are there, he asks them to promise to take his bones up out of Egypt when God takes them to the promised land. When God fulfills his promise to their ancestors, he asks them, "Take my bones up out of Egypt and bury me there in the land of promise." And so they do. Moses in Exodus, Moses takes the bones of Joshua out when he leads the people out of Egypt. And now at the very end of the book of Joshua, they bury the bones of Joseph in the promised land and fulfill that promise made to Joseph long ago. And then the priests, if you remember from the last, way earlier, when the people of Israel were going and sleeping with or the men of Israel were going to sleep with some of the women of Moab, and one of them brings the woman into the camp while the rest of the camp is grieving, and one of the priests goes through and stabs through both of them with a spear, and that priest, who became the next high priest, that guy, Eleazar, son of Aaron, also dies at the end of Joshua, and he's become old. And that ends for us the book of Joshua. So we have the four major movements, or the verbs that kind of control the book of Joshua. First, they cross the Jordan and into the promised land, and we see them, the very first things they do there, the Passover and the circumcision. And then they fight and take the land, they conquer the land, and then we have an account of the division of the land and how all the different borders are drawn for all the different tribes. And then finally, this last call of Joshua to serve God before he dies. One thing that I forgot to mention when I was starting up with Joshua is that actually the name Joshua and the name Jesus are the same name, both in Hebrew and in Greek. In Hebrew, it is Yeshua, which is also the Hebrew for Jesus, Yeshua. And then in Greek, when you translate it over, which is how we kind of get to Jesus, it's Iesus. And so the combination, or kind of, when you hear Iesus and Yeshua together, you get something that sounds like Jesus. And so Joshua and Jesus are actually the same name. Moving on then to the book of Judges. That Judges is different. One thing we don't know for sure who the author is. There's some speculation that it might be Samuel, who is the traditional author of the next two books, 1st and 2nd Samuel. And part of the reason for that is that Samuel is kind of the last of the judges. That's one of his kind of ways he functions, is he's the last of the judges and the first of the prophets. And he's the one that anoints the first two kings of Israel. And his life kind of marks the transition between the period of the judges and the period of the monarchy. And so when we get into we've just finished with Joshua, we finished the period of the conquest, the third major period of the history of Israel. And now we're going to get into the period of the judges, which is the period where the judges ruled. That's why we're calling it the period of the judges, because the judges are in charge, not just because it's the period covered in the book of Judges. And so we're not 100% sure who wrote it, but Samuel is a guess that a lot of people have made because of his role and because of some of the things that are said, especially towards the end of the book, about the people of Israel being very corrupt, and part of the reason for that being because Israel had no king, and so everybody did whatever they thought was best. At the end of the day, though, it doesn't really matter very much who wrote it. It was written, sometime 200 to 300 years after the book of Joshua. There's a period of about 200 to 300 years covered in the book of Judges, and so it's a few hundred years after the period of Joshua, and we've fully gone over into the Iron Age in the book of Judges, because we'll start to see things like chariots fitted with iron wheels, or the chariots made at least partially out of iron. And Judges, the word judge in the book of Judges does not mean what we normally think of when we think of a judge. We usually think of a criminal court judge, or maybe a judge that hears cases, small claims court kind of thing, or at best, the closest thing that we would come to is a judge or an arbiter in arbitration that's dealing with the dispute between two parties, either two companies or between two individuals. And that there are a lot of people that function in that role in the Old Testament that are mentioned. Most of them are kings, because a king was seen as having the authority to make those kind of judgments between people. But there are also people that serve as judges in that capacity, and we'll meet one of them in this story. But for the most part, that's not what we mean by judges in the book of Judges. Those that are called judges are something more like a hero, a champion. And what we'll see in Judges is there's this, what I call, what lots of people call the cycle of apostasy. And apostasy means that you're leaving a faith that you've committed to. So if I'm a pastor, if I were to suddenly decide that I could not practice Christianity for some reason, and I left Christianity, I would be an apostate, because I would have abandoned the faith and left a faith that I had committed to. And so when we say cycle of apostasy, what we mean is that the Israelites are falling away from or leaving the faith that they have committed to. They're not keeping the religious commitments that they made. And the way that this goes is that the Israelites, they'll start off in a pretty decent place. Things are going pretty well for them for whatever reason. And in that comfort and complacency, they will start to experiment with worshiping these gods of the peoples around them. They'll start to worship Baal, or they'll start to worship Asherah, or the Ashtoreth, which is actually the same thing. They'll start to worship these gods or goddesses of the surrounding tribes, and they'll end up going full over and worshiping these idols and making the worship of these idols equal to or even more important than the worship of God. And so they'll start practicing idolatry, and God will reject them over it, because they have started practicing idolatry. In some cases, they will also start practicing all kinds of other things connected with the idolatry, including injustice towards the poor, or towards certain people, like women and children among them, or they'll commit all kinds of sexual immorality and weird stuff around the worship of the gods and goddesses they turn to. But all the cluster of stuff, so they did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and they turned from God and turned towards these idols. And so God will allow something to happen to them. Some other group, some other nation or tribe, one of the tribes they haven't driven out that they were supposed to, will rise to power over them and oppress them, and they'll be stuck in this oppression for however long it takes, until the people get ground down by it enough that they cry out to God for help. And they realize that they have failed and realize they messed up, and so they'll cry out to God for a deliverer, for somebody to help them. And so God will send a judge. And that's what the judge is this hero that God sends to deliver them after they have fallen into oppression because of their idolatry. And this judge will come and do something very heroic, will help them to fight against whoever's oppressing them and overthrow the oppressor, and then will lead the nation. And so they're kind of a combination of a war hero and a governor, and they'll lead the nation until their death. And then after their death, they'll have, during that period that they're alive, they'll have this peace, and things will get to go good for Israel again, and then they'll die, and shortly thereafter, the cycle starts over again. And so they'll be in a pretty good place, and they'll start committing idolatry. And then as they commit idolatry, God will allow them to fall into the hands of their enemies and to be oppressed. And then once they're under oppression for long enough, they will get fed up with it and finally call out for help. And God will send a judge, and that judge will deliver them, and things will go well until the end of that judge's life, and the cycle will go again. And if you look in Judges chapter 2, there's a pretty good summary of that cycle, the way that keeps working in Judges chapter 2. And one of the things that the chapter notes is that each time that they go through this cycle, when it's over and the judge dies, the people will turn to do things that are even worse than their forefathers had done, even worse than the previous generation. And so each time that they go around this cycle, it gets a little worse, and their corruption gets a little more extreme, and things get a little more severe. And so what you have is not just a wheel that they keep running around, but it's more like a descending spiral where every rotation gets lower and worse. It's more like the water going down a drain than just running around a circle. And so that's, when we talk about the cycle of apostasy, or what's happening in Judges, that's kind of the big picture of what's happening in Judges. The people are constantly rebelling against God and doing whatever they want to do, committing idolatry, the cycle of apostasy. And so God will, once they are dealing with the consequences of their actions and they call out for help, God will send the judge to rescue them, and things will go well until they die, and then they'll start the cycle over again and get worse and worse and worse. And this cycle goes on until you get to the last several chapters in the book of Judges, and there's actually no judges in those chapters. It's the final 4 kind of stories in the book of Judges. The last several chapters are really just about examples of how bad things have gotten. And when we get there, you'll see it's just things are really messed up in Israel by this point. So the first of our judges is actually to show you how quickly this went. If you remember, we got our 2 good spies, right? The two guys that went in and spied out the land, came back and said, we can do it with God's help in spite of what the others said. And that was during the period when Moses was still alive. And those 2 were Caleb and Joshua. And then Caleb and Joshua stay alive, and they fight and help to take the promised land. And then Joshua dies, and eventually Caleb dies as well. Well, the things go bad so quickly after the death of Joshua that actually our first judge, his name is Othniel, he is Caleb's younger brother. And so he's from the same generation as Caleb, he's just younger. And so this is like within a few years, like at the very least within a few decades after the death of Joshua, the people start to turn to worship these other gods. And so God allows them to be oppressed by their enemies, oppressed by another nation, and they end up calling out to God for help. In this case, the first case, it's the people of Aram, the Arameans. The king is named Cushan-Rishathaim, which is just fun to say. And he's the king, and they gain power over the Israelites and oppress them. And eventually the people cry out for help, and God calls out Othniel and sends him to fight and lead the people in rebellion against the Arameans, and they succeed. And under Othniel's rule for the next 40 years, Israel has peace. But then when Othniel dies, the people turn and do evil in the eyes of the Lord again. And the second of the judges, if you look in Judges chapter 3, starting verse 12, the second of the judges is Ehud. And Ehud's story is like wonderfully, entertainingly gross. The people of Israel have been taken over and dominated by the Moabites, the people of Moab. Israel had defeated the Moabites on the other side of the river, but they have recovered now. It's some time later, generation later, they have recovered now, and now they are oppressing the Israelites because the Israelites haven't been faithful to God. And so the Moabites have come up, and they have power, and their king is named Eglon. And we're told that Eglon is, well, he's of generous proportions, shall we say. He is a large man. And the Moabites have placed this tribute on Israel. And the tribute is what a conquered people would have to pay to the conquering army to be basically allowed to continue to exist. And so it might be an amount of gold every year or silver every year, or it might be so much of their crops or their flocks every year, whatever the tribute may be. And so they were required to take and give so much of their wealth and their stuff every year to the conquering Moabites in order to continue to be allowed to live and to be left alone. And so this year, Ehud is going to be taking the tribute along with some other Israelites. And so he goes, and the text says, the story tells us that he is a left-handed man. And so he makes a sword, a short sword, 18 inches long, and straps it to his right thigh. And the way I visualize it, it doesn't specify whether it's inside or outside, but I kind of visualize it being the inside of the right thigh so that he goes in without them knowing that he has the sword. And so they apparently they don't expect him to be able to draw the sword because he's left-handed. They know it's there, but they don't expect him to be able to draw it quickly. Or they just don't know the sword's there at all. And when they come into the king, and they lay out the tribute before the king, what they're required to give. And then Ehud tells King Eglon, "I have a message for you from the Lord." And it's a private message. And so the king sends out all of his attendants, clears the throne room except for Ehud and him, and takes Ehud into this space where he can hear this private message. And Ehud approaches the king and says, "I have a message for you from the Lord," and draws out the sword and stabs him right in the gut with it. And the story says that Eglon was such a fat man that when he stabbed him with it, his fat opened up and closed in around the sword and kind of sucked the sword into his innards away from Ehud. So he was so fat that he actually, the sword gets lost in the king. And the king dies, and his bowels empty. And this is all in the story. I'm not adding details here. This is all in the text. Yes, the book of Judges describes the king's bowels exploding or emptying as he dies. And so then Ehud, he has successfully now assassinated the king, and so he closes the door to this kind of inner chamber that they went into to hear the private message from the Lord, and then he goes on out of the throne room like nothing happened, and leaves the palace complex and goes back to the Israelites to begin this military coup now. He's assassinated the king, and now he's going to go and get these leaders of Israel. He's already arranged with them. They're ready to go. So he's going to stir them up to fight. Well, the attendants to the king are, the king didn't come out from the inner chamber, and there's this smell. And so they think the king is using the bathroom. And the text says that the attendants wait until the point of embarrassment, until it's like, at this point, if the king is still in there doing his business, this is ridiculous, and he may be dead. Who knows what's wrong with him? We got to go check on him. And so they go in and find the king dead in this inner chamber where he would apparently also go to the bathroom, and there he is, sword all up inside him, dead. And Ehud then leads the people of Israel that were prepared to fight in a military rebellion, and they throw off the Moabites, and they are free. And this time, the period of peace lasts for about 80 years before Ehud dies, and the people go off their rocker again. And there's a second judge during this period, or immediately after this period, named Shamgar. There's very little about him, and so I don't expect you to remember him. He's not going to be on the test, but he's mentioned as fighting off the Philistines with an ox goad, and he fought off killed 600 men with an ox goad. And an ox goad is basically a sharpened stick that you would use to poke at the back of your ox while you were plowing to make them keep going forward instead of getting lazy and stopping. It's kind of like you might use a whip, or you probably see, if you've seen Westerns where they use a whip to keep horses moving. Old form of that, you would use this sharpened stick at the back of these ox to keep them moving. And so he ends up killing 600 men with a sharpened stick and delivering Israel. The next major judge is Deborah. Of course, you can tell from the name, Deborah is a woman. And Deborah is described as a prophetess, meaning that she receives messages from God and gives them to people. So God tells her things and she tells other people that. That's basically what a prophet does, passes on the word of the Lord. And Deborah is also, she functions as a judge in the sense that we more normally think of a judge. She would gather, and there was this particular tree that she would go to, and people would gather there and present their disputes to her, their cases and their issues, and she would hear the cases, hear both sides, and then come up with a potential solution for both, and tell the people what they should do. And so she would serve as this kind of arbitrator between people that had disputes. And one day she has a message to give to a guy and to tell him God has said it's time for this man to lead the people of Israel, to lead the military of Israel, to deliver them from their most recent captors, people that are oppressing them. And the man's name is Barak. And yes, that is very similar to and is the source of a recent president's first name. So this man, Barak, Deborah calls him in and tells him that God has called him and has chosen him to lead an army of Israelites to deliver them from their newest band of oppressors. In this case, it's the Canaanites. And at first, Barak's first response is kind of, he doesn't understand or doesn't seem to get why Deborah's telling him to go, and he's afraid maybe there might be a trap in there, and so he tells Deborah that he will go, but only if she comes with him, and if she doesn't go into battle with him, then he's not going. And so Deborah agrees and says that she'll go into battle with him, but because he has refused to go because God told him to, just do what God said, he won't get any glory from this battle. He won't get credit for having won. Instead, all of the credit will go to a woman. Since he is unwilling to go into battle without a woman at his side, a woman will receive all of the credit and glory for this battle. And so they go, and the army of Israel fights against this army of the Canaanites, led by a commander named Sisera. And so they have this battle, and the Israelites, of course, are winning. They're beating the army under Sisera, the Canaanites, and they begin to retreat. And Sisera escapes and gets away. The commander of this army gets away. And all of the people, all of the military of Israel is hunting for him, trying to find him so that they can kill him and end this threat. And he goes and he finds this tent. This person set up their tent. And he knows the person, knows the man that owns the tent, and thinks he's sympathetic. And so he goes and he hides inside the tent. And the man's wife, Jael, the man that owns this tent, his wife is named Jael. Jael is there in the tent, and the man recognizes her and asks her to give him something to eat and drink. And so she gives him some food and some milk to drink, and he lays down and is exhausted from the battle. And so as he's starting to fall asleep, he says, asks her to stand at the door of the tent, at the gate of the tent, at the entrance to the tent, and to send away anybody that comes that might be looking for him and tell them that he's not there. And Jael agrees, and Sisera goes to sleep, falls asleep, and not long after he's good and out, she goes and gets a hammer and a tent peg and then drives the tent peg through his temple and out the other side and basically nails his head to the ground sideways. He does not survive. And so Jael kills Sisera, and Jael gets credit for winning that battle. A woman gets the credit for killing the commander and is seen as the hero. And so even though Barak is the one that is tapped to lead the army, actually he kind of gets totally overlooked in this and most of the credit. And so we think of Deborah as being the judge in this case, and Jael is the one that ends the battle. And so Barak just kind of gets glossed over. He was there and led the military, but Jael gets most of the credit, and Deborah is the one we consider a judge. And the next figure, the next guy that we get, next judge, his name is Gideon. And there's no way to do all of Gideon's story, or even to get to the point in Gideon's story that I got with the other class, so we'll go ahead and stop. We've got like 2.5 minutes left. So we'll go ahead and stop here, and we'll pick up with Gideon's story and finish out the book of Judges. We'll get Gideon's story, and then a couple of others, and Samson, everybody's favorite judge, on Friday. And we'll see if at the end of Friday, if Samson is still your favorite judge. We are through Judges chapter 5, ready to start Judges chapter 6.